Warning. The following part of the Atlantis Rising film series is about the origins of racism and anti-Semitism, and therefore contains a shitload of what can obviously and easily be construed as racism and anti-Semitism to the less open-minded and easily offended. It probably doesn't help that it's composed and narrated by a white-ass, blue-eyed, Rh-negative Aryan cracker, but Morgan Freeman was already busy and out of our budget. So if you can't take the heat, don't stand in the kitchen. As the brilliant anthropologist Robert Sepehr pointed out in his highly recommended book, Species with Amnesia, politically correct does not mean historically correct. While the UN and other politically motivated think tanks push the Kalergi Plan agenda to dilute and mix all of the races through migration and interbreeding, removing nationalism and cultural identity pride, while pushing the nonsensical liberal Bolshevik idea that there are no such thing even as different races. We are going to get into what modern genetics and genome projects have undeniably uncovered in the last decade, which is that not only are there indeed very different genetic races, but they are absolutely made up of the ancient crossbreeding between what can be considered completely different hominin and Cro-Magnon species, and that this is the root cause of all of the racism and problems in our modern world today. There is a curious quote in the King James Bible in Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which of were old, men of renown. But who parented these giants, if not giants themselves? Until recently, it was a long-held myth that two different animal species with differing amounts of chromosomes and placement positions cannot breed and produce offspring together. In reality, we have the cama, the offspring of a camel and a llama, the wholphin, a killer whale and dolphin offspring, the savanna, which is a house cat and African serval offspring, the coy wolf, a coyote and wolf offspring. In fact, 10% of North American birds are cross-species offspring. But the cross-species hybrids really of interest to the Genesis quote are The Dizo, or Yakao, the offspring between a yak and a cow, because the offspring is much stronger and larger than either a yak or a cow and can interbreed with either yaks or cows. Or the Growler, the offspring of a grizzly bear and a polar bear, much larger than either of its parents. And lastly, the Liger, the offspring of a lion and a tiger in captivity, which grows to the gigantic size of both a lion and a tiger combined. It appears that in certain cases, giganticism is the genetic result of a cross-species interbreeding. So in Genesis, what ancient advanced hominin species were perceived as the sons of God, or rather the gods, and what hominin species were the daughters of men that crossbred together and produced giant offspring? And what does the Bible mean, came in unto, if not copulated with and ejaculated inside of?
Bro, good point, but this is a wholesome family channel. You can't say that.
No, it isn't, Moses, and yes, we can. Were you ever notified that extensive modern genetic science by both the Human Genome Project and Russian genetic scientists have long ago debunked both Darwin's theory of evolution and the out-of-Africa theory? If not, let's examine the history of why anyone not notified still falsely believes in either. The Piltdown Man, once thought for 40 years to be the proof of Darwin's missing link, now called the hoax of the century, the all-time embarrassment of anthropological science, had the skull of a human and the jaw of an orangutan, which after fluorine-based tests and nitrogen tests 40 years later turned out to be exactly that. An old hominin upper skull combined with a purposely stained primate lower jaw to make it look older and match the human skull. In the meantime, in 1925, the substitute teacher John Thomas Scopes famously went on trial against the prosecutor William Jennings Bryan in Tennessee for teaching the theory of evolution to his students, based on not only Darwin's theory and the fraudulent Pilton Man hoax, but also the Nebraska Man found the same year, a single tooth, which turned out, after Scopes' win and further digging and finding the rest of the Nebraska Man's skeleton, to actually be the skeleton and tooth of an extinct species of wild boar, not a man.
Russell Griswold.
Oink, oink, my good man.
The next proof of Darwin's theory was the 1927 Southwest Colorado Man, based on a partial set of teeth embedded in rock that turned out to belong to an antique horse from the Eocene period. That same year brought us the Montana Man, a fossil molar of human appearance from the Eocene period that turned out to belong to a dog-like quadruped with man-like teeth in the Condylarth Euprotogonia genus. There were many more, but the one most deserving of our attention that is still being falsely peddled today as proof of both the missing link and the now genetically debunked out-of-Africa theory is Lucy, found in 1974 in Ethiopia and named after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the Beatles song that played all night when she was found. They were definitely smoking something. But as with all archaeological finds, we all think of Lucy as the imagined museum statues and book drawings that we get from commissioned artists, with zero educational background in anthropology, osteology, zoology, or paleontology, somehow magically turning a 70% missing partial skeleton with no hands or feet, a few toes, a lower jawbone, and 3 partial back skull pieces, but no brow, nose, or eye sockets, into something that looks more like the 1968 Planet of the Apes. Dr. Charles Oxnard, professor of anatomy and human biology at the University of Western Australia, points out that Australopithecines like Lucy and the many others like her found since are indeed more different from both African apes and humans than African apes and humans are from each other. We now know their feet retain grasping tendencies, with long curved toe digits for holding onto branches. They had undeveloped knee joint locking mechanisms, which allow bipedals like humans to stand upright comfortably for long periods of time. Biochemical studies of their hips and thighs show they did not walk uprightly at all. They have the hand bone morphology of a knuckle walker, absent in humans. Their shoulder sockets pointed upward like apes, built for active climbing and tree life, rather than human shoulder sockets which point outwards to the sides. They had cranial capacities smaller than modern chimpanzees, close eye sockets in the skull, sharp molar teeth, long arms, short legs, and lo and behold, a later re-examination of Lucy's vertebra fragments, too small to fit with her vertebra column, turned out to be a baboon thoracic vertebra, unnoticed for 40 years, and yet no baboon skeleton was found in Lucy's dig. Yet there she still stands today, in museums and in our children's school books, as the missing link. In fairness to Darwin, he openly admitted at the end of his own writings that his theory was possibly bunk, and why other scientists and himself have good reason to think so, most especially the lack of transitional fossil evidence. Indeed, as Robert Sepehr points out, the fossil record to this day indicates zero scientific evidence of a linear progressive model of mankind's rise from small ape-like prosimian creatures to monkeys, then great apes, and finally to us. In fact, what is becoming clear through published research in the fields of genomics and genetics is that mankind may actually be a composite being, a hybrid hominin species as different from monkeys and apes as we are from giraffes, and definitely not from one common ancestor originating in Africa. Before we get into the recent genetic studies and genome mapping of both modern humans and ancient hominin haplogroups, mitochondrial DNA and chromosomal DNA, don't get discouraged, we'll explain this science in simple basic English. Let's do a basic review on epochs, ages within epochs, and hominin species, as there are so many, so we can keep a clear, organized picture in our heads as to what we are actually talking about and from when, at least according to the accepted mainstream science narrative. Yes, we are aware that carbon dating is admittedly flawed by 3,500 years on either side. Geological epochs are just assumptions and may be grossly off from reality, and different people have different religious, scientific, or conspiratorial beliefs about how old the Earth really is, how short these cycles may be, etc. We respect that. We're just going to use the mainstream mapping for now as a visual aid only, keeping in mind that these time frames and fossil record layers could be much different in reality. It doesn't bear relevance to the point about the genetic mapping.
Bro, two disclaimers in 14 minutes? You better not bring up the Jews.
Easy, Moses. We're talking race, not religion right now. First of all, a hominid, ending in D, is a family of erect bipedal, meaning always walks on 2 feet, primate mammal that includes recent humans together, with extinct ancestral and related forms, and in some recent classifications, the great apes, the orangutan, gorilla, chimpanzee, and bonobo. But though those apes can walk for short periods of time on 2 feet, they don't only walk that way or normally do it. They are knuckle walkers like Lucy, which is our first clue that a deceptive, agenda-fueled deception is purposely taking place. We are purposely using the term hominin, ending in N, meaning any of the taxonomic tribe of hominids that include recent humans together with extinct ancestral and related forms. In other words, get rid of the knuckle-walking quadrupedal monkeys and apes in the hominid category, and that's what you are really descended from. Epochs are simply mainstream science-imagined geological eras of major change based on rock strata, layers, ice core samples, the fossil record, isotopes, and a host of other factors. The periods we're concerned with are the end of the Pliocene epoch, allegedly 3.2 million years ago, the Pleistocene epoch, in which there was an alleged ice age near its end up until around 11,600 years ago, and the current Holocene period that we live in now. It is in these epochs that we find the hominin species that are genetically related to modern humans, as well as physically similar to us and not monkeys and apes. Lastly, within these epochs we have ages, where there are drastic changes in the types of food, shelter, clothing, tools, weapons, art, jewelry, technology, and the metals being used by our hominin ancestors, such as the Stone Age, allegedly starting 150,000 years ago, the Bronze Age, 4,400 years ago, and the Iron Age, around 2,800 years ago. Again, these are just loose interpretations and the imagination of artists with zero education in sciences. Created from conjectural genetic and skeletal descriptions they've been given from so-called scientists. If you Google any one of these, you'll see a myriad of pictures so different from each other, some of them bordering on the absurd, right out of the old Planet of the Apes movies, clearly drawn by people who, based on debunked pig and horse teeth, still falsely believe that we all evolved from African monkeys, having not been filled in on the discoveries of genomic halotype mapping over the last 15 years. As we are about to genetically establish that these hominins are a different taxonomy from monkeys and are our real ancestors, I've purposely picked reference images that more resemble humanoids and not the primate house at the Brookfield Zoo. But what does any of this have to do with Atlantis, let alone the origins of racism? Everything. Elementary, my dear Watson, and patience. The earliest previous modern Homo sapien remains, that's most of us, were found in a Greek cave allegedly dating back to 194,000 years old. Just a few years ago, modern Homo sapien remains were found in a Moroccan mine dating back to 300,000 years ago. Now, these are not exact sciences, because we only have guesses based on what we found, where we found them, and when we guessed that was from. Someone might find an older Homo sapien skeleton somewhere else, or new modern dating techniques might arise that debunk all of our current assumptions, as constantly happens in archaeology and anthropology. But based on what we know for now, well, where did all of these diverse Homo sapiens come from? Did they just teleport to Morocco 300,000 years ago from another dimension? Genomic mapping proves certainly not. All we can do is look at the groups of hominins that we know were around at that time, and even the ones we don't yet have modern fossil evidence of, but have genetic evidence of from older fossil remains, and it starts to become crystal clear where we came from. As Robert Sepehr points out, it is common knowledge and well-known fact in the small scientific circles that study and read the papers published on both the human genome and how it compares to the other hominin genomes, which have now also been sequenced, that the one common ancestor originating in Africa, also known as the out of Africa theory, is actually the opposite of reality. Regrettably, within the mainstream press and academic circles, there is a conspicuous and seemingly deliberate vacuum when it comes to reporting and informing the public about their controversial implications. Even worse now in today's political climate. Nobody wants to touch this subject with a 10-foot pole in fear of backlash and the cancel culture. And who can blame them? The out of Africa theory is definitely a linchpin in the black pride, white guilt paradigm, and God knows the black and African communities are still fighting for the respect and retribution they deserve, and I personally applaud them for it. But again, politically correct is not historically correct, and master race bullshit is still master race bullshit, no matter which skin color tries to play that card. So this film is not going to be very popular to either side, understandably.
Bro, tell them about genes, haplogroups, and shit.
Glycosylamines are biochemical compounds of glycosyl groups derived from carbohydrates that attach to an amino group and form a bond. One of these attached to a 5-carbon sugar is called a nucleoside, and when that is attached to one or more phosphate groups, we get a nucleotide, which are essential biomolecules within all life forms. When you get a sequence of these nucleotides in a row in DNA or RNA, which encode the creation of either more RNA or proteins, we call this sequence of nucleotides a gene. When 2 or more of these genes or nucleotide sequences occur alternatively in the same exact place on a chromosome tree position, we get an allelomorph or an allele. And the groups of these alleles inside of us constitute our genotype, which could be, for example, an allele with the possibility to express green, blue, hazel, brown, or a combination of any of them in eye color. You might have brown eyes, but it does not necessarily mean there are not also blue and hazel-eyed gene nucleotide sequences on your chromosomal eye color tree that can be passed on to your children and expressed physically in them. These groups of alleles that can be passed down to offspring from one single parent of the two are called haplotypes. So we get separate gene haplotypes from each parent, or rather, groups of different physical gene expression possibilities for various physical features and even certain behaviors. One of the many startling revelations of genomic studies show that contemporary Europeans shared genetic continuity with ancient Europeans, but do not have many of the genetic markers found in modern Africans. Sub-Saharan Africa, orange, purple, and yellow. Finland, Sweden, Norway, none of them. For instance, Homo heidelbergensis genes are never found in non-Africans. Yet its species was around 700,000 to 300,000 years ago, at least according to modern fossil record dating. But he never migrated to Scandinavia in 400,000 years? Why? A haplogroup study published 8 years ago in 2012 called Re-examining the Out-of-Africa Theory and the Origin of Europoids, or Caucasians, in the Light of DNA Genealogy, studied paternal lineage Y chromosomes, which are genes passed down from father to son, and looked at 7,556 different genetic haplogroups, and found there were 0 African genetic markers in any of the 400 non-African participants in the study. They concluded that Europoid or Caucasian haplogroups did not descend from African haplogroups A or B, as not one of the non-African participants tested positive to any of the 13 African subclades of haplogroup A, and none of either the European nor non-European participants from other parts of the world carried any of the 16 gene haplotypes of the genetic haplogroup A or 3 haplotypes of genetic haplogroup B that were found in the African participants. They concluded sub-Saharan Africans did not leave Africa to colonize the rest of the world, as the one common ancestor out of Africa theory previously guessed before genetic sciences were available. As Robert Sepehr points out, geneticists have not only mapped the entire human genome, including people native to every continent, but have also successfully sequenced nearly complete genomes for ancient hominin species such as Neanderthal, Denisovan, African Archaic, Homo erectus, and even the Hobbit species, Homo florensis. Not to mention our proverbial Atlantean elephant in the room, Cro-Magnon. Cro-Magnon's DNA is fully modern and unchanged for 28,000 years, and still matches exactly today with the genomic structure of the modern peoples of Dalarna in central Sweden and southeast Norway. And guess which famous eugenics-driven maniac was into the genetics of his Aryan northern neighbors? But before we get into that, it was found back in both 2012 and 2013, after mitochondrial and nuclear DNA were extracted and sequenced from Neanderthal fossils and compared to the modern human genome, that Neanderthals contributed to the gene pools of nearly all non-African populations, as well as a small percentage, 7%, to the Maasai tribe of East Africa, a few of whom I've met personally. And Neanderthals contributed 40% more DNA to modern East Asians than to modern Europeans, indicating that Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal interbred at some point while coexisting together. Then, Denisovan fossil remains were found in East Asia that genetically matched the modern people of Melanesia, or what we call Micronesia, which is Fiji, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Indonesia. But the stunner is found in an article in the Journal of Nature titled "The Complete Genomic Sequence of a Neanderthal from the Altai Mountains, which are located in Siberia, between Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia," remarkably finding that across the world, the Native American Mixay people of eastern Mexico and the Caratiana people of eastern Brazil carry both Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA that differs from that carried by Europeans. As the article states, and as we'll get into with Native American legends, the difference in Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, in contrast to Europeans, might be able to help solve a long-standing mystery, and that's whether or not part of the native population of the eastern seaboard of the Americas, where Atlantis once was populated by or admixed with Europeans long before the time of Columbus and other European colonial explorers. Indeed. There are plenty of other studies, which we'll link in the description, showing that modern native African genomes still contain signs of ancient mixing with other archaic hominin species, which are not present in non-African people's DNA, and that this cross-species breeding was most recently happening in Africa up until about 30,000 years ago, at least according to mitochondrial DNA mutation timelines used by genetic sciences. And recently, the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen sequenced the DNA of a 37,000-year-old male skeleton found in Kostanki, Russia, which showed that present-day Scandinavians are the closest living relatives, genetically speaking, to the first Cro-Magnon in Europe, and that many European traits, including those from the Middle East, were already present in the first Europeans, as well as multiple ancient hominin and even Neanderthal species admixture from around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Unfortunately, forget about races, it too showed the original Europeans were a mix of different species, genetically speaking, from African and other lineage mixes. And then we have blood types, which transmit much more exact than any other genetic characteristic. Let's dispel two myths right now about the Rh negative or rhesus negative blood type occurring in 1% of the world population. My own blood type is AB negative, the rarest, and there are people out there who claim I'm a reptilian or descended from alien astronauts. But I can assure you I have no tail or forked tongue. Reptiles are quadrupedal. At least I think they're supposed to be. And I've still not received any Christmas cards from the Galactic Federation of Light. And no, people with Rh negative blood are not genetically related to rhesus macaque monkeys. It was first discovered by Carl Landsteiner in 1930 and named after the rhesus macaque monkeys he discovered this blood type in and named it after them. Rh molecules are just protein antigens found on the outside surface of red blood cells, found in all primates, and in some form or another in most life forms ranging from algae, fish, humans, even some bacteria, and most, but not all, hominins. As Robert Sepehr points out again, if Rh negative blood is simply a mutation, then why is it that so many Rh negative people are also found to have an extra vertebrae? This is also conveniently explained away as a genetic mutation. We all know that certain blood types cannot receive blood transfusions from certain other blood types that are not compatible. We also know that an Rh negative mother's antibodies can, in certain cases, attack her Rh positive fetus's blood after cells from the Rh positive fetus enter her bloodstream. This can be fatal to the fetus, and Rh negative pregnant women are given special injections to combat this. If mankind evolved from the same African ancestor, then everyone's blood would be compatible, but it is not. Rhesus negative blood types appear suddenly, 35,000 years ago in Cro-Magnon. Where did the Rh negatives come from? Why does the body of an Rh negative mother carrying an Rh positive child try to reject her own offspring? Humanity is not one single race descended from the same African ancestor, but a hybridized species. All right, that dude might have descended from aliens. This brings us to another myth about the origins of both North and South American indigenous natives crossing over from Northeast Asia to Alaska around 13,000 years ago, and European settlers discovering the New World 500 years ago, now seemingly debunked by other recent studies, this time on mtDNA, or mitochondrial DNA, this time passed down from the mother to the child, and the controversial haplogroup X. What's special about mitochondrial DNA is that it is the DNA of bacteria-like organelles found inside of human cells, but with its own DNA code, not actual human DNA. And that bacteria-like DNA is passed down from mother to children in utero and on down through the female line. Since mitochondrial DNA does mutate at a well-understood, observable, and predictable rate, scientists can not only analyze and compare it in modern human populations to each other to see which groups are related, how long the breeding occurred, and migration patterns based on mutation comparisons, but they now have taken the mitochondrial DNA from the bones and teeth of ancient hominins thousands of years old and done the same. In the 1998 Dr. Michael Brown study entitled mtDNA Haplogroup X, an ancient link between Europe, Western Asia, and North America, has a history-rewriting conclusion after discovering 3% of the Native Americans tested had mitochondrial DNA from the European haplogroup X, and those from the Ojibwe tribes settled on the Atlantic side of the Americas, due west of Atlantis, had a concentration of 25%. As the study said, It has been proposed that a fifth mtDNA haplogroup X represents a minor founding lineage in Native Americans. Unlike haplogroups A through D, haplogroup X is also found at low frequencies in modern European populations. The results identified a consensus haplogroup X motif that characterizes our European and Native American samples. Among Native Americans, haplogroup X appears to be essentially restricted to northern Amerindian groups, including the Ojibwa, etc. Media network analysis indicated that European and Native American haplogroup X mtDNAs, although distinct, nevertheless are distantly related to each other. Time estimates for the arrival of X in North America are 12,000 to 36,000 years ago, depending on the number of assumed founders, thus supporting the conclusion that the peoples harboring haplogroup X were among the original founders of Native American populations. To date, haplogroup X has not been unambiguously identified in Asia, meaning it's not normally found in Asians, though some has been found in peoples living near China's Tarim Basin, famous for its ancient, tall, red-haired Caucasian mummies. Raising the possibility that some Native American founders were of Caucasian ancestry. So much for Columbus, Polo, Eric the Red, and the Vikings. In fact, when the alleged landmark pioneers Lewis and Clark ran into the Missouri and North Dakota Mandan Sioux tribe, and remember that name, Dan, we'll get back to the importance of that later. Lewis was shocked that many of the Indians in the Mandan tribe had blonde hair and blue eyes. What's more, the layout of their village was not like any other tribe in the country at that time. They had a European-style layout of their village town, and the joints of their log cabins were fitted together like that of Northern European style. The Mandan claimed their great father came from across the great waters from the east. They were referring to the Atlantic Ocean, or Atlantis. Atlantean Cro-Magnon was already there in the Americas at least 12 to 36,000 years ago, and maybe even much longer. There are many other haplogroup and Y-chromosome genetic studies done on multiple burial sites in native peoples. Then you can find these referenced in Robert Sepehr's books, Species with Amnesia, and I can't recommend his book or YouTube channel, Atlantean Gardens, enough. We'll leave a link. Go check him out if this subject interests you. Blonde hair and blue or gray eyes are recessive gene traits that must be carried by both parents as an expression possibility. In fact, less than 17% of the 330 million people in the United States have blue eyes, yet all but 6, or now 7, including Obama, of the first 44 presidents are believed to have had blue or gray eyes. What are the odds? In fact, it's not just the United States. When we look at other Western world powers, against all odds we see the exact same trend. A 17% recessive genetic minority seems to be 90% dominant in its political and even business elites. This is statistically impossible unless something more ancient, hidden, and deeper is going on here that the general public is not aware of. You can also carry blonde hair or blue-eyed genetic traits in your chromosomes without expressing them yourselves. And it would be very interesting to know how many of these political and business elites have Rh negative blood types as well. We see it everywhere. A 17% genetic minority as the overwhelming ruling majority, from the world's richest billionaires, and even in Hollywood, to the popes and the cardinals, and let's not even get started with the royal families of the world. So what the fuck is really going on here? Especially in light of the fact that evidence is now emerging that the European royalty and money families were actually black. like King James of the King James Bible, King George, the Habsburgs, the Tücker and the Reiter families, the Zwickau, Fugger, Kirchberg, and Augsburg's families are black. The Roman Hesse Empire, clearly black. And we have our African and Egyptian queens. But then hang on, aren't we told there is a white Jewish conspiracy to take over the world? But if the Bergs are actually black, then what is really going on? Well, for starters, there was not just one single wave of Atlantean Hyperborean Cro-Magnon invasion interbreeding with and ruling the rest of the world's already interbred hominins, but multiple invasion waves over at least the past 45,000 years, the last wave being in the age of Aries, around 2200 BC to 140 BC, at least on the alleged mainstream timeline, which is where we get the name Aryan or term Aryan race from. The last of the many Atlantean Hyperborean Cro-Magnon worldwide invasions in that time period, each time bringing new tools and advanced methods for hunting and architecture, agricultural technologies, animal domestication, metallurgy, philosophies, arts, crafts, religions, and even advanced sciences, or what used to be called magic. Archaeologists and anthropologists call these the ages, but are dumbfounded as to how the world could last for thousands of years at a time with no new technological leaps or advancements, and suddenly all make the same leaps at roughly the same times into each new age, despite allegedly being isolated from each other. To understand the prevailing racist mindset of these Atlantean Aryan Cro-Magnon ruling bloodlines, you can always spot them in pictures and paintings by their hidden hand and unnaturally bent pinky finger making an M-shaped Masonic hand gesture in the other. We can look to the writings of Ignatius Loyola Donnelly in his book Atlantis. I will change the audio wording to more politically correct, though his choice of words and writing give deep insight into this mindset of these people. I cannot believe that the great inventions that dumbfound archaeologists and anthropologists were duplicated spontaneously in different countries. There is no truth in the whole theory that men pressed by necessity will always hit upon the same invention to relieve their wants. If this were so, all indigenous tribes would have invented the boomerang. All would possess pottery, bows and arrows, slings, tents, and canoes. In short, all races would have risen to civilization, for certainly the comforts of life are as agreeable to one people as another. Civilization is not communicable to all. Many indigenous tribes are incapable of it. There are two great divisions of mankind, the civilized and the uncivilized, and every civilized race in the world has had something of civilization from the earliest ages. And as all roads lead to Rome, so all the converging lines of civilization lead back to Atlantis. The abyss between the civilized man and the indigenous is simply incalculable. It represents not alone a difference in arts and methods of life, but in the mental constitution, the instincts, and the predispositions of the soul. The progeny of civilized races in his sport manufacture water wheels, wagons, and houses of cob. The indigenous amuses himself with bows and arrows. The one belongs to a building and creating race, the other to a wild hunting stock. This abyss between the indigenous and civilized has never been passed by any nation through its own original force and without external influences upon them during the historic period. Those who were uncivilized at the dawn of history are uncivilized still. Barbarian slaves may have been taught something of the arts by their masters, which we will get to, and conquered races have shared some of the advantages possessed by their conquerors, but we will seek in vain for any example of an indigenous people developing civilization of and among themselves. I may be reminded of the Gauls, Goths, and Britons. all of them Atlantean Cro-Magnon DNA populations on the Atlantic coast. But these were not uncivilized people. They possessed written languages, poetry, oratory, and history. They were controlled by religious ideas. They believed in God and the immortality of the soul, and in a state of rewards and punishments after death. Wherever the Romans came in contact with the Gauls, Britons, or German tribes, they found them armed with weapons of iron. The Scots used chariots and iron swords in the Battle of Grampians. The Celts used iron-headed spears and coats of chainmail armor, and the Gauls were armed with soft iron swords. They cultivated the ground, built houses and walled towns, wove cloth, employed wheeled vehicles. They possessed nearly all the cereals and domestic animals that we have, and they wrought iron, bronze, and steel. The Gauls even invented a machine on wheels to cut their grain, thus anticipating our reapers and mowers by 2,000 years. The difference between the civilization of the Romans and the Gauls was only a difference in degree and not in kind. The Roman civilization was simply a development and perfection of the civilization possessed by all the European populations. It was drawn from the common foundation of Atlantis. If we find on both sides of the Atlantic precisely the same arts, sciences, religious beliefs, habits, customs, and traditions, it is absurd to say that the peoples of two continents arrived separately by precisely the same steps, at precisely the same ends. When we consider the resemblance of the civilizations of the Mediterranean nations to one another, no man is silly enough to pretend that Rome, Greece, Egypt, Assyria, and Phoenicia each spontaneously and separately invented the same arts, sciences, habits, and opinions in which they all shared. Why, then, should a different rule of interpretation prevail between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean from that which holds good as to the two sides of the Mediterranean? If similarity of origin of Mediterranean nations has unquestionably produced similarity of arts, customs, and condition, why in the other should not the similarity of their arts, customs, and condition of nations across the Atlantic prove similarity of a common origin, Atlantis? This is exactly in line with the worldwide empire that modern researchers are calling Tartaria right now. But very few researchers point out the glaringly obvious, that the name Tartary is Aries, the astrological age of Aries, the last Atlantean Aryan invasion wave from 2300 BC to 150 BC, also known as the start of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Remember, many peoples are still in the Stone Age 4,000 years later. And Tartaria ends in Aria, named after the Aryans, the people of Cro-Magnon Atlantean Hyperborean gene mixtures. We have the blue-eyed, sometimes blonde-haired Kurds of Iran, Aryan, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Caucasian, Aryan, the blue-eyed Illuminati king of Jordan, Denmark, Aryan, the blue-eyed royalty of Sumeria, Sumerian, the red-haired, blue-eyed Tartarian, Ghengis Khan, Aryan, the red-bearded, blue-eyed bringers of civilization to South America, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, and Kulka Khan, where we get Genghis Khan, Aryan. The Anunnaki were not aliens, they were Aryans, Atlanteans. They were just so technologically and mentally ahead of their time, they seemed like gods to the primitive people. Just as you and your flashlight, iPhone, and laptop would look to a primitive jungle tribe today. On the Atlantic Ocean side, the North American native Shawnee, Cherokee, Algonquin, and Chippewa all have legends of the saintly white-bearded teacher with eyes as gray-green like the ocean, whose sign was the cross that he wore on his garments, and who was a healer and had control over the winds, waters, and other natural elements. In other words, advanced wind, water, and possibly etheric energy technology, sailing, alchemy, plant medicine knowledge, astronomy, and other magic. Christians claim it was Jesus, but as we'll prove later, it was the Irish Atlantean Aryans whose ancient capital before Dublin was Tara or Tarian, and their priests of Yesu. It is interesting that he taught love and peace and that good deeds were important, because on the other side of the world, we have the teachings of the blue-eyed royal aristocratic, meaning Aryan, prince, Siddhartha or Siddharian Gautama Buddha. Whether among the brown-eyed, dark-skinned people of India or all the way up in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, the Buddha is depicted as light-skinned and blue-eyed. The Indo-Aryan Scythians came into Assam, India, from the Gangetic Plains around the beginning of the Iron Age, 500 BC, and introduced horseback riding, etheric architecture, the Brahmin caste system, and this same religious system brought to the Americas. The many blue-eyed ancestors of these ancient elites still exist there today in populations of the Punjabis, Sindhis, Rajasthanis, and Gujaratis. And sure enough, in China, just to the north of where this Indo-Aryan invasion came to India, we find that strange little pocket of modern people with haplogroup X, right where red-haired Aryan mummies were excavated, wearing swastika jewelry and other etheric energy technology. So much for the primitive caveman. Now, it's no secret that many white people, especially red-headed, freckly ginger types, sunburn very easily. So the idea of Hyperborean Atlantean Cro-Magnon from the cold north living in warm places like South America, India, Mexico, or even northern Africa and Egypt probably sounds absurd. But it's also no secret that iron oxide is one of the main ingredients in sunscreen to help absorb UVA radiation. What is a secret is that red ochre or red clay earth is an excellent source of various kinds of iron oxide pigments and is also known as Venetian or actually Phoenician or actually Irish Phoenician red, English red, and Indian red. It was used in cave paintings that are still in excellent condition after many thousands of years. What any idiot can see is that Native Americans do not have red skin, and the Egyptians were not colorblind. So what aren't we being told? Since this film is about racism, some years back there was a big hoopla about how it was derogatory to Native Americans to call the football team the Washington Redskins, and people demanded it be renamed. The irony of that was that the term Redskins came from the massive amount of red ochre found by the colonists inside the burial graves in the New England states, mostly Maine, as well as Labrador, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. These people were and still are called the Red Paint People. Later, these exact red ochre graves and skeletons were found on opposite coasts in Brittany and Denmark. You've probably noticed all of these locations are on opposite coasts of what was formerly Atlantis. The even bigger irony is that these skeletons were of white-skinned maritime archaic people, racially matching the Basque people of Spain, who themselves have 35% Rh-negative blood and claim to be the direct descendants of Atlantis. The tools, weapons, and boats of the red paint people were far superior to those of later Native Americans in other parts of the country. We find the exact same in Egypt. Somehow, a 17% recessive, blue-eyed, red blonde-haired population is the ruling nobility bloodline in ancient Egypt. Hieroglyphs clearly show they know the color difference between the various races that occupied Egypt, and yet we always find the gods and the pharaohs not only painted in the same white garments that the native North and South Americans spoke of their wisdom bringers wearing, but also painted with red skin. Was this red ochre sunscreen? Were these Atlanteans? The Incas, Aztecs, and Mayans were also obsessed with the blue-eyed, red-skinned people. And rightly so. Not only are nearly all of the world's languages derived from one common ancestral Proto-European and Indo-Aryan root language, but as Connor McDarry points out in his book Irish Wisdom Preserved in Bible and Pyramids, I'll leave an audiobook link in the description, all of the native traditions, customs, and even words of the tribes throughout the Americas share the common ancestry and root language of Celtic Gaelic. You can pause the screens here and read some examples of this, and there are plenty more to be found in Donnelly's Atlantis book. Compared to other hominins, Cro-Magnon stood well over 6 feet tall, sported very heavy cheekbones, a heavy brow, and a strong jaw from chewing agricultured grains. He was dilococephalic, meaning long-headed from front to back, or literally a dickhead, and yet had a short face and a large forehead. Anthropologists call this disharmonism, and it is a defining characteristic trait of Cro-Magnon man. You'd need one hell of a hat to cover a noggin like that. Even at a Billy Ray Cyrus concert, you'd be hard-pressed to find as many blue-eyed, light-skinned crackers as you do on the list of popes, or looking at all of the bishops and cardinals in the various church factions and council of churches. Even the TV evangelists are dominated by them. Hell, there is even controversy about other famous religious icons with skin like that of the full moon, but that's none of my business. Somehow, this 15% blue-eyed Aryan genetic minority seemed to dominate the world's billionaire list, the royal families, Hollywood, Freemasonry, and thank God for all of the incredibly gifted black artists, or the music industry would be dominated by the same ridiculous phenomenon. I have to wonder, are they covering their eye or their eye color?
Bro! My people know you're stalling. You know what we're all waiting for you to discuss.
There aren't enough disclaimers in the world for this section, Moses, but I'll try my damnedest. There are many people who falsely believe, and have purposefully been deceived into believing so, that there is a conspiracy by a certain religious group of peoples to take over the world.
For us, the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations.
The world was already taken over a long time ago, not by a religious group, but a physical, biological species. Genetic species are very real and do exist. Belief systems are fictional and do not exist in reality. You can choose to believe in Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, or the Easter Bunny, or Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, but at any second, You can choose to stop believing in one and believe in one of the others, or in none of them, so they don't actually exist. You cannot choose to have a different eye color or skin color tomorrow. Well, Jewish people are not a biological race. They are just people who share a common fictional belief system. Zionism is also a fictional belief system, and there are 12 different kinds of Zionism: political, practical, synthetic, labor, revisionist, cultural, revolutionary, religious, reform, Christian, neo, and post-Zionism. Not all of them are even Jewish, but all of them are nothing more than fictional chosen belief systems. Jews don't run the world because they don't exist, but Aryans who claim to believe in Judaism might run the world. Blaming all Jews for Zionism is like blaming all Christians for the KKK, or blaming all Muslims for ISIS. So long as you're blaming and not critically thinking, it's all a logical fallacy. Real Jews get their asses kicked by the Cro-Magnon IDF for speaking out against any of this. People will say, well, what about the false Jews? The Khazars, it's right there in your face. Khazarians, Ashkenazi Jews, Ashkenazis. Like the swastika, the Star of David is ancient Aryan Cro-Magnon Atlantean etheric energy technology. The Hebrew Phoenicians were not Jews and were not the origin of the Celts of ancient Ireland and Scotland. The Sumerians and Phoenicians were colonies of the Aryan Atlantean Irish Celts, the Phoenicians. This is why they don't want people to speak Gaelic anymore, because they'll figure out that not only are the Gaelic and Hebrew land systems the same, but the languages are as well. Hebrew, Irish, and Gaelic are the same thing. As McDara points out, Phoenicians was a phony name applied to the Irish race. It is written purposely in this form of spelling, which has served well in throwing people off the track and has helped very well in keeping up the deception. If they had written the word in its plain form of Phoenician, there would be too many who were liable to see the true meaning of it, and thereby get a clue as to the real truth which was meant to be concealed. The word Fionn, or Finn, is an Irish name of the sun, and the Phoenicians were the Irish sun worshippers of the Magian priests of Yesa, or Jesus, the Irish sun god, who brought their civilization and arts already developed in Ireland with them to Egypt. There they erected their monumental altars to the god of the sun, of which the Great Pyramid was the crowning symbol and masterpiece. They carried their mission from there to the farther lands of the East. Every Irishman who today speaks the Irish language, when speaking the name of Jesus Christ in his native tongue, pronounces it Iesu Christ, unconscious of the fact that this was the Savior on the cross, worshipped by his forefathers for ages, even before Rome was founded on her 7 hills, named after Ireland's 7 Sisters Mountains. In fact and in truth, it was the Irish who founded Rome itself. It was anciently an Irish colony and a church establishment founded by the Phoenicians, the Irish, for both trading and religious purposes, and they gave to it its name and has been shown by the etymology of the word Rome. Suffice to say that Rome had a most urgent reason for bringing about the Dark Ages and plunging the world into ignorance. This she accomplished by denying education to the people, which still happens today. There's an old joke about what's a blue-eyed, red-haired guy named Jesus, or Yesa, doing hanging out in the ancient Middle East with guys named John, Paul, Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Well, in the alleged 11th to 14th centuries, Rome devoted her efforts to having fictitious histories written of the different countries, and endeavored to make all of those histories correspond with each other. In this way, the priest scribes figured that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to discover how Rome obtained her savior, her Bible, and her religious institutions. Christianity did not originate in Rome or in any part of the Roman dominions. It is only a false and fictitious assumption to ascribe the beginning or origins of Christian religion to Rome. That is, from the time of the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, when Rome formally adopted it. The real and true facts of Christianity say that it was the religion of ancient Ireland for thousands of years previous to that date. This was at a time when Rome was but a colony of the Irish Church, the same as the rest of the Mediterranean church colonies or settlements, such as Syracuse in Sicily, taken from the Irish name Circia or Syracuse, the Easterner or sun, where we get the name Syracuse, New York, on the Atlantic or Atlantean coast, and the sun-worshipping Iroquois or Irish, Aryan Indians also on the Atlantean coast, which were established there by the Irish Phoenicians, the sun-worshippers. This fact is cryptically preserved in the mythic legend of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers. As we know, the sun-worshipping Aryan Illuminati like to speak code forward and backward. Romulus is said to have founded Rome, and from him Rome is said to take its name, Rome, Romulus. Romulus and Remus are but two formulated or concocted names of the sun. Romulus, read backwards Illuminati style, is Sulamor, Solosmor, the great light, the sun, and Remus, read backwards, is Sumer, Sumeria, summer, as it was meant to be. Summer is a mythical idea, Irish name of, and a true aspect of the sun. These names are taken from the Irish, in fact, as well as in ideal. One of the Irish names of the sun is Som, Somra, summer. It is no coincidence Scottish Rite Freemasonry comes out of Celtic Aryan Atlantean Scotland, or that it is a carryover from ancient Egyptian Irish Aryan Atlantean priest mystery schools. I'll tell you who else comes from Aryan Scotland. Those blue-eyed Rothschilds. They are not Jews, and they are not Khazarians. Like myself, you've probably heard and regurgitated the ridiculously far-fetched cover story a million times without giving it any further thought. Some loser backstreet Frankfurt, Germany money changer and loan shark named Mayer Amschel Bauer hangs a red shield on his door, in German a rote Schild, on it the Aryan symbol for etheric energy tech, and decides to change his last name not to the German name and pronunciation, but a butchered English translation in bad first-year German, then magically falls in the company of princes, royalty, ex-Jesuit Illuminati, and gets his buddies around his Tuesday night poker table and lays out his plan for world domination over the next 300 years. As you do on your 15-minute smoke breaks when you're a nobody loan shark. But as Miles Mathis has discovered, Rothschild literally means child of Roth. But who are the Roths? They are none other than the Aryan Celtic Leslies, Earls, and Dukes of Roths, Scotland. Roths comes from the Gaelic Rothaeus, the area of Scotland where the Leslies, Dukes, and Earls of Roths are located. And Rothaeus comes from the ancient Aryan Hebrew root Roth, or Wrath, meaning wise person. The Red Shield story is nonsense. The 7th Earl, or nobleman of Roths, was a banker, appointed Lord High Treasurer of Scotland in 1663, and was later elevated to Duke. King Charles later made him Lord Chancellor of Scotland for life. He married into the Lindsays and Hamiltons, and his daughter married a Hamilton of the Earls Hamilton. When he, the 7th Earl of Roths, died, the dukedom ended, and the earldom was passed to his daughter, and her son became the 9th Earl of Roths. So who was the 8th Earl of Roths, or nobleman? It was not his daughter's husband, the Hamilton she married, because he was already the Earl of Haddington, And when the earldom of Roths was rechartered in 1663 to the 7th Earl's daughter, it was stipulated that the two earldoms of Haddington and Roths must remain separate. So the 8th Earl of Roths was the male child of the 7th, who took the family fortune to his relatives in Germany during the English Revolution and changed his name to the Child of Roths, Rothschild. That is how he was mingling with princes, nobility, and ex-Jesuit Illuminati. Now, let's go back to the Atlantean-Aryan root of all of this mess and look at the Indo-Aryan languages in Europe, and I want to show you what happens when you don't understand that Hebrews were not Jews. They were Irish Atlanteans, so you only get the story half correct.
Vikings are Jews. Let's go back to the old story of Moses. Moses and the Israelites were expelled from Egypt. They traveled to the promised land, to the land of Eden, situated in the Holy Land. There they became the people of Eden. Later, the symbol of their people became the cross on which their former king, Yeshua, died. In the year 800, they had to leave the Holy Land because of massive floods. After a while, the people of Eden land with their boats in northern Europe. There they set foot on ground and call it Eden Land, after their lost homeland. When the locals ask who they are, they say they are Vikings, possible meaning refugees. In the year 1000, suddenly a new language is popping up. Dietz, the root language of the so-called German languages and of English. Dietz, Dutch, Dietsland, Deutschland. So where is this Dietz coming from? Well, what language were the Vikings speaking? Coming from the Holy Land, they were talking Judean, Yiddish, Dish, Dietz, Dutch. That's why they were calling themselves Vikings. So Deutschland actually means Dietzland, Yiddishland. They were Christians importing Christianity. The priests were followed by the Viking soldiers that morphed into the Crusaders. The red-white colors with the cross on their shield was the symbol of their mythical lion. The Lion of Judah, the Ari. So they became the Aryans. Another name for the Vikings was the sons of Noah, the Ashkenazi. So in World War II, the Aryans, the Ashkenazi of Yiddishland, were killing off the Jews. The Templars were conquering Europe. Building castles and cathedrals for their Viking high priests, the Gothi cathedrals. Later, they conquered the Americas. They started ruling the waves. And now, the Viking flag is still ruling land and sea. Are you still wondering why the US, England, Switzerland, Europe are so close with the Israelites? That is because they are one and the same.
We're told that Atlantean destruction survivor Noah and his ark happened to land on Mount Ararat, or Aryan Rat, in Armenia, or Aryan Menia, just south of the Caucasus mountain range, where we get the term Caucasian from, near the Republic of Alania, or Atlantia. But this guy Noah had 3 sons of completely different mixed races: Japhet, a total Aryan cracker; Ham, black as the night; and Shem, a Shemite or Semite, a mixed race mulatto. Noah must have been the Hugh Hefner of his time. And then he divides his lands between his 3 sons, which is clearly a metaphor of Cro-Magnon Atlantean invasion in earlier waves. Unless Noah was paying $5,000 a month child support to hoes in different area codes, which is doubtful. But let's take a look at the either real or metaphorical Caucasian son Japhet, and the overlapping area of shared territory of these 3 brothers, where all of the political and religious problems and conflicts of the world still exist today, which conspiracy crowds call Caesarea, the land of the false Jews and alleged birthplace of the world domination conspiracy. Looking at the migration of Khazar or Aryan tribes into regions of Eastern Europe, mainly Russia and Poland, where at the dawn of the modern age the greatest concentration of Jews were found, has led several historians to conjecture that a substantial part, and perhaps the majority, of Eastern Jews, and hence of world Jewry, might be of Khazarian and not of Semitic or Shemitic origin. The far-reaching implications of this hypothesis may explain the great caution exercised by historians in approaching this subject, if not avoiding it altogether, to avoid upsetting believers in the dogma of the chosen race. The Turkish-speaking Karaites of the Crimea, Poland, and elsewhere have affirmed a connection with the Khazarians, confirmed by evidence from folklore and anthropology, as well as their language. How important is that presence of the Caucasian sons of Japhet in the tents of Shem? A new approach both to the problem of relations between the Khazarian Jewry and other Jewish communities, and to the question of how far we can go in regards as the Khazarian Jewry as the nucleus of the large Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe, the Aryan descendants of this settlement, those who stayed where they were, and those who emigrated to the United States and other countries, and those who went to Israel, constitute now the large majority of world Jewry. The large majority of surviving Jews in the world is of Eastern European and thus Khazarian origin. As this film has stated, their ancestors came not from the Jordan, but from the Volga, not from Canaan, but from the Caucasus, the first cradle of the Aryan race after the destruction of Atlantis, and that genetically they are more closely related to the Hun, Uyghur, and Magyar, or Irish Gnostic Magi tribes, than to that of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Should this turn out to be the case, then the term anti-Semitism or anti-Shemitism would become void of meaning. The story of the Khazar Empire of Japet begins to look like the most cruel hoax which history has ever perpetrated. Jewish diplomat Hasdai first heard of the existence of an independent Jewish kingdom from some merchant traders from Khorasan in Persia. Later, he found a considerable amount of factual detail about the Khazar kingdom, including the name Joseph, its priest king. Hasdai sent a letter to King Joseph containing a list of questions about the Khazarian state, its people, method of government, armed forces, including an inquiry to which of the 12 tribes this King Joseph belonged to. King Joseph's reply proudly emphasizes that the Khazarian kingdom proves the lie of any who say that the scepter of the Aryan Lion of Judah has forever fallen from the Jews' hands, and that there is no place on earth for a kingdom of their own, meaning it never was Jewish in the first place, but Aryan. And King Joseph then proceeds to provide a genealogy of his people, though himself a fierce Jewish nationalist in his fictional religious belief. He cannot and does not claim for them biological Semitic or Shemitic descent. He traces their genetic ancestry not to Shem, but to Noah's third son Japet, or more precisely, to Japet's grandson Togarma, the ancestor of all Turkish tribes, who had 10 sons himself, including Uyghur, Dersu, Avars, the Huns, Basali, Basel, Switzerland, Tarniak, the Khazars or Khazarians, Zagora, the Bulgars, and Sabir, or Serbians and Siberians. Look around at your World Economic Forum, your political leaders, your billionaires, your royal families, your Freemasons, your religious leaders, your neoconservatives, your Silicon Valley leaders, your Hollywood stars, the top transhumanists. Who's really out to screw you? These people? Or can you now recognize blatant propaganda when you see it? Count Kalergi wrote the Kalergi Plan to bomb and displace African and Middle Eastern countries, flood Aryan Europe with those displaced immigrants, and mix the races so that the genetic Aryan European population would go extinct. The Aryan bankster family Rothschild adopted and funded the Kalergi Plan to annihilate Europe, and the United Nations is executing the plan under the name Replacement Migration, a part of UN Agenda 21. But who was Count Kalergi? And why are the Aryan House of Roths helping him annihilate Aryan Europe? Born in Asia and known as the father of the European Union, mixed-race Count Coudenhove Kalergi spoke Aryan Gaelic Hebrew, had 3 Jewish wives, and was a Freemason. His father was close friends with Aryan Zionist Theodor Herzl, the alleged founder of Zionism, who himself was friends with the blue-eyed Baron Louis de Rothschild. Aiding on behalf of the false Jewish B'nai B'rith, coming out of the Gaelic and Irish Aryan language of the overuse of the apostrophes and names, he instituted the extermination of the Aryan race, despite his best friends being the blue-eyed leader of the Aryan race, as you do. Count Kalergi was the founder and president for 49 years of the Pan-European Union, the forerunner of the EU. In his 1925 book, Praktischer Idealismus, he says this: "The man of the future will be mixed race. The Eurasian Negroid race of the future will replace the diversity of peoples. Russian Bolshevism constitutes a decisive step toward this purpose. A small group of communist spiritual aristocrats, what we now call technocrats, govern the country." In 1950, the Count was awarded the first Blue-Eyed Cracker King Charlemagne Prize. Other winners of the award have included the White Cracker 15% genetic minority Blue-Eyed Winston Churchill, Henry Kissinger, Edward Heath, Bill Clinton, and Tony Blair. An ironically undiverse group of award winners for wanting to replace the world with mixed-race Eurasian Negroids, unless the small group of communist spiritual aristocrats left to govern them all is still Aryan blue-eyed crackers. A December 1939 letter to Dr. Gamble in the height of the Aryan eugenics movement from Margaret Sanger, who was the head of the Negro Project, to introduce birth control and sterilization to the black populations in the U.S. South, out of the eugenics idea that the less children you have, the more prosperous you are. Keep in mind, white Roman Catholic families like my own were having 10 to 15 children, but there was no Whitey Project going on for them, and the world is filled with ghettos and slums, full of families with only 1 or 2 kids. Margaret Sanger wrote, "Miss Delph was here for Thanksgiving, and I am more than delighted to learn that she was able to get $850 from various birth control organizations. I think that my pick of her has been justified, even though she is a little higher priced than the ordinary. In other words, a highly effective salesperson, passionate about reducing the black population. There is only one thing that I would like to be in touch with, and that is the Negro Project of the South. I note that you doubt it worthwhile to employ a full-time Negro physician. It seems to me, from my experience, that while the colored Negroes have great respect for white doctors, they can get closer to their own members and more or less lay their cards on the table, which means their ignorant superstitions and doubts, or perhaps religious spiritual objections to birth control and sterilization. They do not do this with white people, and if we can train the Negro doctor at the clinic, he can go among them with the enthusiasm and with knowledge, or sales training, which I believe will have far-reaching results, depopulation, among the colored people. His success will depend on his personality, how good a salesman he is at talking people into self-depopulating, and his training by us. The religious minister's work is also important, and also he should be trained in selling this depopulation idea to his congregation, perhaps by the Federation, as to our ideals and the goal that we hope to reach. We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Gee, now why would they get that idea? Margaret Sanger went on to found Planned Parenthood, who in July this year admitted she was a horrific bigot.
One issue that really grabbed me as urgent were issues related to population, reproductive health.
But did you come to reproductive issues as an intellectual?
When I was growing up, my parents were always involved in various volunteer things. My dad was head of Planned Parenthood, and it was very controversial to be involved with that.
She'd have 8 children, and what the developing world does not need is more children.
And I think that was the biggest aha to Bill and me when we got into this work, is we asked ourselves, of course, the same hard-nosed question you'd ask, which is, if you get into this work and you start to save these children, will women just keep overpopulating the world? And thank goodness the converse is absolutely true. They don't do that because women say to themselves they want 2 children to survive into adulthood. If she knows that 2 will survive into adulthood, she will naturally bring down her population.
They deserve to get this vaccine first. And from there, you want to do tiering in various countries to make sure your most vulnerable populations get it. In our country, that would be Blacks and Native Americans, people with underlying health conditions, and the elderly.
The Atlanteans are truly rising from the ashes. And no, that's not them, that's Shem. To leave this film on a positive note, there may have been various hominin species that interbred together over countless tens of thousands of years, and it may even be that one of them, Cro-Magnon, was far advanced beyond its time compared to the others, may possibly have seemed like gods to the other species, and even ruled and brought them technology and so-called civilization. But as the genetic studies show, at this point in history, unless you're an isolated jungle tribe, all of us are completely mixed with each other's genetic species roots, and aside from the common shared roots, everyone has unique genetics that other people do not have, and vice versa. For those who are after true diversity, which is what makes the world wonderful, this is the best news for the Homo sapien taxonomy as a whole. No one race, hominin species, or person is any better or any more important than the other. And judging by the world and society today, the Aryans may have brought comfort, technology, and inventions during their 4 invasion waves, but they also brought pain, suffering, war, and ways of life that have evolved to be not harmonious with natural living and peaceful coexistence. We saw evidence of black nobility, literally, already in Europe as well, like Black King George III. And the Black Habsburgs appear to have not genetically inbred themselves to extinction as the story goes, but have been removed from the historical records and replaced by Aryan imposters. And certainly they may have been genetically mixed with Cro-Magnon invasions from tens or thousands of years earlier, but they are proof that just because we hominins didn't all come out of Africa doesn't mean African-dominant gened people are savages, as racist Aryans like Donnelly claimed. Quite the opposite is true, clearly. Some of the greatest inventions today are coming out of places like Africa and India, not from Aryans, and they seem to be of the purpose of benevolence towards our fellow man, not towards self-profit, warfare, death, and destruction. Our Atlantean Aryan wannabe overlords have much to learn from those whose genetics and cultures are sadly lacking in themselves. Racism is not a human phenomenon. In Tabasco, Mexico, there are 2 distinct territorial species of racist howler monkeys who will interbreed with each other in a hybrid zone between their 2 territories, but neither species will mate with or allow the hybrid offspring back into their own territories, quarantining them to the geographic hybrid zone in the middle. That said, there is also a tiger and a goat in a Siberian zoo who are best of friends. The goat put there by zookeepers to feed the tiger, but both realizing they are lonely and isolated in the same common prison together, decided it more advantageous to look past their differences and live together as friends, rather than kill and eat the other for immediate self-gratification. We could all learn from these 2 beautiful souls. If this film has offended you in any way, it offended me too, and I made it. See, we all have more in common than we wish to admit. It is better to have hated and stopped hating than to never have hated at all.